Guilty Gear is a long-standing series with quite the legacy behind it, and with quite the legacy, naturally comes legacy system mechanics. There are a number of mechanics at this point that have been in Guilty Gear for most, if not every game, and there's a couple of mechanics that people would associate with Guilty Gear at this point, things like burst or Roman cancel. But today, I want to talk about a different mechanic. I want to talk about a mechanic that, in my opinion, is the hardest mechanic to use, but also quite possibly the strongest one. I am, of course, talking about Instant Block. Instant Block is another mechanic that has been in most Guilty Gear games, and frankly, most Arceus games. Is in BlazBlue and Persona and even GranBlue as well. So it's a mechanic that they've used a lot, and they changed it up a little bit in Strive, and in my opinion, it's actually the strongest iteration of the mechanic. It's a mechanic that's so strong that with proper implementation, it can actually completely change the structure of offense and defense in the game. It can turn something like a safe block string ender to being a full combo punish opportunity for the defender if used correctly. However, despite its strength, it's not a mechanic that you actually see used that often outside of the absolute top level of play, and even there it's not used as often as you might expect. It's also a mechanic that I remember when Strive first came out that people were saying how it might be too difficult to use and we might not actually see people using it long term. But fast forward to where we are now, and you actually do see people implementing it and trying to use it. I think it's a mechanic that's pretty misunderstood, and because of how often people talk about how difficult it is, a lot of people shy away from trying to use it. So today, I want to kind of demystify a bit of that and get more people to feel encouraged to use it. So today, we're going to be talking about what is Instant Block, how does it work, why is it good, and of course, we're going to be talking about how to use it better and what situations it can be strong in. We're going to be covering everything you need to know about Instant Block in Guilty Gear. But before we get into it, I do actually want to know what you guys are on YouTube. What do you guys think about the mechanic? Is it a mechanic that you've tried to use? Have you tried using Instant Block much? Have you been discouraged from using it? Do you not really understand it? I want to get a general idea of how people feel about Instant Block, because despite how strong it is, it's just not used much and not talked about much. So let me know down below what you think about it. If you do enjoy this video, please consider dropping a like as well. Likes and comments actually help the YouTube algorithm a ton. And I'm really trying to grow my channel, so I'd really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video as well, consider subscribing. That way you can be notified when I upload future videos. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into talking about Instant Block. So the first thing we should probably talk about is just how Instant Block works in the first place. In order to perform an Instant Block, you're going to have your controller in a neutral position, so either a 5 or a 2 input like this. And then right before the attack makes contact with you, you're going to input a 4 or a 1 for a block input. So something like this. So you'll see right up there, it says just up in the top left corner. That's how you know you got an Instant Block. Now, when I say you have to input your block right before it makes contact with you, I do literally mean right before it makes contact with you. So back in Guilty Gear Xrd, the Instant Block window, I believe, was 8 frames, which is actually pretty generous. That's big enough that, like, if you practice it a little bit, you can get it fairly consistently once you get used to the situations. However, in Strive, they changed this, and it is now a measly 2-frame window, which is laughably small. This is small enough that even if you've practiced it and you're fairly confident in the situation, you can still miss the window a fair amount. So surely, with how hard this mechanic is to perform, it must be very powerful, right? Well, it definitely is. So what does Instant Block actually do? So again, in the previous game, in Guilty Gear Xrd, Instant Block would actually reduce the amount of block stun an attack put you in, and the amount it reduced it by would actually change depending on the attack it was. This is a pretty cool system to interact with and created a lot of depth, and actually a lot of moves previously were actually designed where you pretty much had to instant block them to be able to deal with them, but it was easier to instant block them, so it was more understandable. Now in Guilty Gear Strive, they actually changed this almost entirely, so it no longer reduces the amount of block stun that you receive. What you'll notice is that whenever you block an attack, naturally you occur, some pushback, so you're pushed away from the opponent. What Instant Block does is it actually removes this pushback almost entirely. And when I tell you that this is very powerful, I really, really mean it. Being able to almost entirely remove pushback can completely change how an interaction can go. Just to give you an example of how game-changing this can be, let's use an example of Kai's 214S. So this is normally a block string ender that Kai's will use because it's a frame trap, and on counter hit, he can get a full combo off of it. And on block, even though it is -8, I believe, he's not actually in range to be punished usually. Rand's 5k should be fast enough, but it doesn't actually reach him to punish him. However, if we're able to instant block this 214S, it changes the situation almost entirely. So instead now, I'm able to get an entire close slash punish, and I can just get a full combo off of this now instead. So what turned out to be normally a safe block string ender now Kai could have lost upwards to 50% of his life bar because I instant blocked it. This is a pretty extreme example of the mechanic, but there's a lot of situations like this across the cast, of situations that change almost entirely just because you're able to manage an instant block. Now, another thing about instant block is that there's actually two types of IBs in this game. There is the normal type of IB that we've been talking about, and there's also instant block faultless defense, or IBFD for short. FD is another very common mechanic in Guilty Gear. It's a way where you can spend meter to be able to increase the amount of pushback that someone receives. And IBFD is pretty much an extreme version of this. And IBFD is also basically the polar opposite of IB. When you perform an IBFD, it actually dramatically increases the amount of pushback they receive instead of reduces it. And this is also very, very powerful, naturally. This can turn a lot of situations from, a potent offensive situation to dramatically reducing how scary it can be to outright completely nullifying your opponent's offense. Both of these mechanics on their own are very powerful, but what takes them over the top is how they work in tandem with each other. Because you as the attacker can never really know or be certain of whether they're going to IB or IBFD at any given moment. The fact that you're never sure whether you're going to have your pushback removed or your pushback dramatically increased makes the options as a defender much more varied in what they can do, and makes it that much harder to be prepared as the attacker for what you should be looking for. Now that we have a basic understanding of how IB and IBFD work, I actually want to talk about what makes them difficult, because I think it's a little bit misunderstood, and understanding why it's difficult is actually important to using it better. Another very important difference about Strive compared to something like Exerd is actually how they changed the cancel windows on normal special moves. So in Guilty Gear Exerd, the cancel windows from being able to do a normal into another normal, or Gatlings as they're called, was actually much tighter in most instances. You didn't actually have as big of a window to be able to cancel something like a close slash into a 2S, or a 2S into a 5H, for example. In most cases, those moves had to be canceled into each other almost immediately, making it a little bit more deliberate and easier to understand when to go for an instant block. In that game it worked out because a lot of moves had better frame data, so it didn't really matter. But here in Strive, they kind of went for an opposite approach. Frame data generally in Strive is worse. A lot of moves are minus or straight up punishable on block, and they look to use the pushback on them to keep them safe, which gives you an idea of how strong instant block can be. But the other thing as well is that they actually dramatically increase the cancel windows on your cancels in Strive. So just as an example, after my close slash, I can delay my 2S almost as long as I want to. There's basically no window where I can't cancel my close slash anymore. This also applies with my 2S into my 5H, or even my 5H into a special cancel. I can cancel pretty much at any point I want to. So compared to a game like Exerd, which was a little bit more strict in how its cancel was for most of their moves, in Strive, your cancel window is whatever you want it to be. And that level of variability is actually what makes instant block so hard to use. Not only are you dealing with a 2-frame window, which is very hard even with practice, it's the fact that so many of these situations, your opponent can just delay what they're doing to such a variable amount that it's basically impossible to know what timing you should go for instant block in a lot of situations. Not everything has this type of cancel window, keep in mind. Things like K buttons and P buttons, they actually have a smaller cancel window, so you actually can't delay them as long as you want for the most part. But generally speaking, the cancel window on everything is extremely variable, and that in large is what makes instant block so difficult. And when it comes to figuring out when and how to get better at instant blocking, it's actually understanding what situations where they can't delay their cancels. So with that all said, let's actually start talking about how to use instant block more effective and what situations instant block is good at. So a first question people might have is it better to IB or IBFD? The thing about this type of mechanic is that naturally, when it comes to defense and fighting games, it's actually the part of the game that takes the most understanding of not just your character and the system mechanic, it also takes understanding your opponent's character, understanding how their pressure works, and understanding the key situations where a mechanic could be useful. So when it comes to IB and IBFD, I would say that IB is a little bit more nuanced as to when it is effective. Being able to IB something and remove the pushback can be very effective, where it can create a situation where you can outright punish a move, or create a situation where the RPS is much more in your favor. But if you're not as familiar with your opponent's character, understanding what options are on the table can be a little bit harder. So I'd say IB, while it's still very effective, is a little bit more nuanced to when you want to use it. Whereas something like IBFD, I think, is more generally applicable in more situations. You're just pushing the opponent further away from you and creating a situation where, their options are reduced to what they can do. The amount of pressure they're putting on you is reduced. They're not usually in range to create mix-ups anymore because you're IBFDing them away. So with that in mind, I would say IBFD is a little bit more generally applicable. If you're just trying to get used to using the mechanic and get the timing down, IBFD is probably a safer bet. Whereas I'm not discouraging anyone from getting used to IB, just know that it's a mechanic that takes a little bit more understanding and probably labbing things down, that type of thing, to use effectively. So as I was mentioning, one of the most important things when it comes to IBing is understanding situations where your timing is not actually going to be that variable, where you can kind of almost count on the timing of the thing that you're looking to instant block. One of the most common situations where this actually comes up is going to be on knockdowns. Because your opponent is trying to meaty you, the meaty is usually going to be hitting on the first frame of your wake up. Naturally, it's kind of the point of a meaty, right? So because of that, you actually have a pretty good idea of when they're going to try to hit you. And because of that, that gives you an easier time to target for an instant block. An important thing to keep in mind with instant blocking is that once you get better at the input and you're a little bit faster with going from a neutral input to a back or a down back input, you're not really risking very much trying to instant block. So for example, if I try to instant block here against Kai and I'm too early, I'll just block it just fine, right? So usually if you're trying to instant block something, it's safer to try to err on the caution of being too early, because in that instance, you're just going to normal block it. So it's not much of a downside. You just tried to IB and you messed up. There's not much punishment there. If you try to do it too late, usually you'll also be fine for the most part, because you're trying to hit a 2-frame window anyways. You're trying to do that. Being late is going to be difficult to time it in a way where you're late and you also get hit for being late. It will happen, and it's something you got to kind of iron out, but just consider IB as something that's like kind of free to try, especially when it comes to wake up, because like I said, you can always just try to target the IB window a little bit too early. If you're too early, you'll just block normally. But medias are a really good time to try to go for an instant block. Specifically, I would usually recommend an IBFD more so than an IB, because usually you're IBing like a close slash, which is already plus on block, so IBing it doesn't usually help you that much. There are some things that IBing a media can help you with, but generally IBFDing is really effective. And by the way, as a quick tip for IBFD, I should have mentioned this earlier, but you don't actually have to time the back and the FD input at the same time. So if you look at my inputs, I'm actually holding P and S before the knockdown, and then I'm attempting the IB input afterwards. So just like that. So as long as you're holding the two inputs at any point and then you attempt the block input, you'll get an IBFD as well. So yeah, meaties are a really good time to try for an IB or an IBFD. And if you're too early, you'll be fine. IBFD is usually better against meaties than IB is, though there are some things where IB can be effective. Another situation where IB can be very effective is actually after characters P and K buttons. As I was mentioning earlier, usually those buttons have a smaller cancel window. So for example, after blocking Kai's 2K here, trying to instant block his 2D is pretty good, because there's not a lot of options after K buttons. First of all, usually characters will cancel into either their 2D or their 6Ds, and generally it will probably be their 2Ds. And the reason why IBing the 2D is effective is that after 2D, there's no other cancel beyond a special move. So in this instance of Kai doing 2K 2D, which most characters in this game are going to be doing 2K 2D, it's effective against almost every character. After I block Kai's 2K 2D, the only thing he has available to him is a special cancel. And his 2D is actually minus enough on block to be punished by our 2K. So if Kai just lets his 2D rock on block, we are threatening to punish it with a 2K 2D of our own, right? And as I was just showing earlier, if Kai instead wanted to do something like run up 2K 2D, and then he reacts at us instant blocking his 2K 2D with 214S, he's running the risk of us then blocking the 214S and getting an even better punish than what we were going to get if we just punished his 2D. So there are all sorts of situations like this for characters, and namely a lot of 2K 2Ds are not really that delayable. Some are more delayable than others. That actually does depend on the character. But it is a situation that is good to look for in IB against most of the cast. And this is really what you're looking for when it comes to IBs, usually, is finding situations where the opponent does not have any cancel options after you instant block them, and also finding situations where the opponent is not able to vary their offense that much, which again is going to take understanding your opponent's character. So next, let's show a good example of how to use IBFD, and we're going to be using Nago for this example. So one thing that Nago players really like to do is they like to do their far slash series, cancel into clone into Fukio, and use that to establish plus rates. A character like Nago, he really only needs to win one situation like this, so finding good ways to mitigate these situations will actually help your win rate against this type of character a lot. So how does IBFD help us against this? Well, normally after you block this far slash series, you're actually not able to jump out of the clone because the gap isn't big enough. If we land an IBFD, the gap is now big enough that we can jump out of it and try to punish him for any type of follow-up attempt he might try to do. Now, this isn't guaranteed. The Nago player could react and cancel their Fukio into DP or something, but that's a whole other layer that the Nago player has to be prepared for. You could do jump forward instead of jump back. There's a lot of other ways to, kind of utilize this. But the idea is that IBFD is now creating a situation that wouldn't exist otherwise. Even just FDing isn't enough to do this. You have to IBFD it. Naga Far Slash is a really good target for this because the second hit of his Far Slash series is not actually delayable in any way. It's one of those types of attacks that you actually have to do it immediately. So because of that, not only is it an effective attack to IBFD, it's one of the easier ones to IBFD because it always has to come at the same timing. So these are just a couple of situations to give you ideas of where and how you would use these mechanics. Now, the reason why these mechanics are so strong is that theoretically, if any human could IB or IBFD on demand any single attack that they wanted to, offense would probably not exist in this game. You'd just be able to mitigate literally everything. So the mechanic is entirely balanced around the fact that it is hard to perform. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't try to IB or IBFD any random block string from your opponent, right? Even if they are delaying their Gatlings to try to frame trap you or whatever, there's a lot of opportunities to be able to try to IB or IBFD these things. And like I was saying earlier, IB is kind of like free to try, like technically you can get hit trying to do it, but usually you won't. And the effectiveness of even just getting one random IB or IBFD in a block string can be very beneficial. So definitely don't feel discouraged from trying to do this against various block strings, especially when you feel comfortable against a character and you kind of understand what they're going for. If you're looking to use instant block more, look for situations where your opponent's offense is not that variable, situations where they kind of have to do something at a very specific timing. That way it's easier to time an IB. And look for situations where if you instant block the move, it will open up a situation where your opponent does not have any options to deal with the instant block and puts them in an unfavorable RPS situation. If you're looking to use IBFD, look for situations similarly where the offense is probably not that delayable, but usually when you want to use IBFD, it's situations when you're looking to mitigate a mix-up or keep the opponent further away from you to reduce their options to be able to mix you up. Instant blocking is a very, very fun mechanic, and one of the things that makes it very interesting in this game is the fact that it's one of the only passive defensive options, and that's something I've always really appreciated about Guilty Gear and Arc Sys games in general, is that they give you a defensive mechanic that is a very high skill ceiling. That's more of a passive option as opposed to a more proactive option like jumping or mashing or something like that. It's a very powerful mechanic once mastered, and a lot of people kind of shy away from getting into it because of how hard it can be, but there's only one way to get good at something, that's by doing it. So I definitely encourage you to go try and find ways to use the mechanic. Just try it out. If you're going to get hit for trying to use instant block sometimes, it's fine. It's part of the process. If you have any good tips of when to use instant block or how to get better at instant blocking or situations where it's a strong choice, be sure to share with people down in the comments below. If you have any questions about instant block or anything Guilty Gear related, frankly, feel free to let me know down in the comments below as well. I love helping people. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.